The morning was crisp, with the sun's light just beginning to break through the mist that hovered over the town. The kind of morning that felt full of promise, a fresh start. I was sitting at my desk, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee and scanning through the emails that had piled up during the night. My thoughts were elsewhere, as they usually were when my phone rang. "Hello?" I answered, half expecting a client or a colleague. I need your help." The voice on the other end trembled, thick with panic. "I don't know what to do anymore." I straightened up in my chair, suddenly alert. "Who is this?" "My name is Richard Blackwell," the voice continued, "and I need someone to check out a house. It's not safe. Something's wrong with it." I raised an eyebrow, wondering if I was dealing with a prank. "What do you mean, not safe?" "I've owned this house for years," Richard said, his voice growing more frantic. "But I can't bring myself to stay there. Every time I try, something happens. It feels wrong. I've tried everything, locking up, leaving, but when I go back, it's never the same." His words were laced with fear, and something about the rawness in his tone stopped me from brushing it off. I had inspected plenty of abandoned properties, some in worse shape than others, but what Richard was describing felt more than just decay. It was unsettling. I agreed to meet him there the following morning. The address was on the outskirts of town, in a remote area where few houses stood. The thought of visiting an isolated property stirred an odd sense of curiosity within me, but it was also just another job to me, something to check off the list. But I wasn't prepared for what I would find. The house was a dilapidated old thing, sitting at the end of a long, winding road. Trees crowded it on all sides, their gnarled limbs casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch across the path. The house itself stood like a broken monument to the past, its faded, chipped paint and sagging roof a testament to years of neglect. Despite the glaring signs of abandonment, there was something off about it, an oppressive stillness that gripped the land around it. I parked my car and got out. The dry crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound as I approached. The wind was faint but persistent, and it carried a sense of foreboding that made my skin crawl. I hesitated for just a moment before pushing open the creaky front gate and heading up the cracked steps to the porch. The door was ajar. It seemed like it had been left open for a long time, but when I stepped inside, the feeling of silence was overwhelming. The air inside was stale, filled with the smell of old wood and dust. The house felt as though it had been frozen in time, caught somewhere between decay and eternity. My flashlight cast long beams across the darkened rooms as I moved through them. Every step on the floorboards was amplified by the stillness. I had been in enough abandoned homes to know the sounds of an old structure settling, but here, it felt different. There was a hum of energy, a sense that something was watching me. I made my way through the living room, taking note of the peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. The house was in terrible shape, but there was something strange about it. It didn't feel like just an old, neglected home. It felt like a place that had been left for a reason. I couldn't explain why, but I felt the weight of that thought hanging in the air, suffocating. My steps led me toward the staircase. It was narrow and steep, the wood groaning under my weight as I ascended. The atmosphere grew heavier the higher I went, the air growing colder. By the time I reached the second floor, I was certain the house wasn't just abandoned. There was something about it, something that didn't belong. I glanced down the hallway, where a door stood ajar at the very end. There was a strange pull toward it, an almost magnetic attraction that drew me in despite my better judgment. I moved slowly toward it, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with unease. Inside the room, everything seemed too perfect. It was as though the house had left it untouched on purpose. The bed was neatly made, the sheets smoothed out, and everything was in its place. But as I stood there, taking in the scene, a sense of dread began to settle over me. The room was too clean, too pristine, for a house that had been abandoned for years, and that's when I saw it, a photograph on the nightstand. The photo showed a smiling family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. They were standing in front of the house, dressed in clothes from a different era, their smiles wide and forced. There was something unsettling about their eyes. They weren't looking at the camera, they were looking through it, past it, as if their attention was fixed on something behind me. I turned, but the room was empty. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the sound grew louder, more persistent. It was coming from the walls, as if something was trapped inside, trying to get out. My heart raced. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, the air shifted. It was colder now, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, thicker. A whisper, barely audible, brushed against my ear. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. But there was no one there. The scratching continued, now accompanied by a low, guttural sound. Something inhuman. I couldn't explain it, but it was clear I wasn't alone. Panic surged through me as I bolted from the room, racing down the stairs. The noise followed me, growing louder with each step, the darkness closing in around me. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath, the cold night air filling my lungs. I glanced back at the house, but the door had slammed shut. I had no idea what I had just experienced, but I knew one thing for certain. The house wasn't abandoned. It was alive,